So, good morning, and good morning. Welcome to all of those joining us on Bere Island from other parts of the world online. Today is Holy Thursday. This evening we begin the first liturgy of the Easter Mysteries with the Mass of the Lord's Supper, the founding of the ritual that became the Eucharist. So I thought today we might sort of backtrack in the sequence of the story as we've been following it. Yesterday we left it after the trial and just on the point of the death of Jesus, which of course we commemorate tomorrow. So we go back a little bit to that Last Supper that he shared with his disciples before Gethsemane. And in a way, Holy Thursday and Good Friday are complementary. In a way, they both express the heart of the mystery of Easter and the Passion. And it's the heart of caring, I think. The deep care that Jesus shows to humanity in these two different ways. But in both these ways, there is a self-giving, a self-offering, a sacrifice of self. So I thought we might explore that mystery of Holy Thursday and of the Eucharist this morning. The primary responsibility of parenthood is, I suppose, to ensure that the children are fed, and that the parents among you recognize that. And that's the basis. Then, of course, there's shelter and emotional care and development and allowing the child to grow into, oh, here's a child. He's running into the arms of his father. Good. Hello. Ezekiel, yes? Ezekiel. So that primary responsibility is, I think, to feed and to give the shelter that provide the basis for fuller development, fuller growth, and maturing. It's the basis on which all other kinds of caring are built. If you neglect that basic care, then the other forms of care don't really have much relevance. But we do not live on bread alone. We have to share. Hello. We have to share what we have. We have to be careful we don't eat too much, that we eat healthily, and especially we have to be conscious of the need, of the responsibility we have to feed the hungry and to help them to achieve the dignity of feeding themselves. It is not just a question of bringing relief, temporary relief. The relief agencies of the world hopefully come into action when there's a famine or when there's a desperate crisis. But the real gift of caring is that we help people to find the dignity, the self-respect that is involved in looking after themselves, in caring for themselves and helping them to care for others in need. So sustainable care. A very young child, before he or she is able to feed themselves, is fed, either at the breast or, with a spoon. And at the other end of life, the very old, the infirm, may often have to be fed because they are unable to feed themselves. So I think this one basic natural way we could have of looking at the meaning, the spiritual meaning of the Eucharist. The Eucharist is obviously not about just having your daily intake of vitamins and carbohydrates and everything else. But it is based upon that natural symbolism. And the early Christians, apparently, we see a few examples of it in the scriptures and the records, didn't quite get that right. Their agape meals, the Eucharists that they celebrated, went over the top a bit. They began to drink a bit too much and eat too much. It was too much of a party. Well, I wouldn't say that is the problem today in the way we celebrate the Eucharist. It doesn't have much of a sense of a party in most cases. So getting the balance right is important, and also what is important is that we don't see the Eucharist just as being fed. Because one of the things old people, or anyone really, would be frightened of and nervous about would be losing the dignity of being able to feed themselves, a very basic human action. And when we're unable to feed ourselves, we know that we are temporarily or permanently moving into our sort of second childhood. So the Eucharist is not about passivity. It's not just about being fed, sitting in the pews and being told or being given what is good for us. There are two essential elements of the Eucharist that I think come out of the scripture reading and the text for today, which we'll listen to now, and which also becomes very obvious when the Eucharist can be celebrated in a free way and in a meaningful way. And always, we always remember, especially in the themes we've been looking at this week, the relationship between community and fidelity and betrayal. The community is not perfect. It will never be perfect. It's not a romantic experience living in community. And this is made very clear by the fact that at the beginning of this meal, Judas, the inevitability of betrayal is raised. It disturbs the disciples to be told this, and Judas is there at the meal as well. So we have to that keeps us realistic. But during supper, he took bread, and having said the blessing, he broke it and gave it to them with the words, "Take this, this is my body." Then he took a cup, and having offered thanks to God, he gave it to them, and they all drank from it. And he said, "This is my blood of the covenant shed for many. I tell you this, never again shall I drink from the fruit of the vine until that day when I drink it new in the kingdom of God." So then they sang the Passover hymn. This was the Passover meal. This was a religious ritual. For the Jews, especially today, after the era of the temple, the home is the temple, really. The home is the place, as much as the synagogue, where the religion is celebrated every Friday evening. And I remember a Jewish friend coming to Mass once at our community, joining us, and on a Friday evening, and he he said how similar it was, to the Seder meal on the Shabbat meal. So this is a religious ritual. It's described here in very few words. Mark is the most economical of the gospel writers, and yet it says everything. It says it shows us that the two essential elements of the Passover meal, of the bread and wine, become identified with Jesus, or he identifies himself with them. He goes, as it were, plunges deep into the symbolism of this ritual, and identifying himself with it, he gives himself to his friends and in faith to us. Fully aware of the apocalyptic nature, the fact that this is going to be the last time he celebrates it, and that this is, although he's giving himself, that would include his life, his whole self, it is also in the knowledge of his coming death. So the Eucharist is about this self-giving, but it's also about the distribution of food. It is given away, it is shared, as it is at a table, at a family meal, or wherever we gather to eat together. It's the most natural thing for us is to eat together, just as it's very natural for us to meditate together. It's just something built into our human nature and our communal nature. Aristotle, I think, said that man is a political animal. Well, we could say we are communal creatures. We need community, we thrive in community, we learn and grow through community. So the first element, and the great sign of that community, is the fellowship of the table, the family meal. Rarely, much rarer now than it was in the past, but the family meal, or Christmas or Thanksgiving, times where we come together not just to talk, not just online, but we will travel halfway across the world, halfway across the country, to be physically together around a table with food on the table. So the distribution of the food physically is one central aspect of the symbolism of the Eucharist, and the other is empowerment. The empowerment that this gives to the people who are sharing the food. So these two things, I think, take us into some aspects anyway of the mystery of the Eucharist. The fact that the food is distributed equally, and secondly, that the people who share it feel enriched and empowered. They're not being fed, they are sharing the meal. The great danger, of course, in the liturgical celebration, the way it's become more formalized, more official, more rule-oriented, that the Eucharist becomes a passive event and even the architecture of our churches and the pews and the separation long distance sometimes from the altar. This doesn't disempower the Eucharist, but it certainly makes it more difficult for us, I think, to feel what the Eucharist, what the Mass really means. There's the danger that we sit in the pews and we're kind of trapped in the pew. Maybe one of those people who like to sit on the aisle, but if you don't, you get stuck in the middle. A bit claustrophobic sometimes. And that's it, and you're stuck there until the end, and you have to keep quiet. There isn't the opportunity to share, to break the word, to discuss the readings, for example. So now there's a certain inevitability about that. It's different when you celebrate the Eucharist in a small group, where you can sit around a table or you can sit on the floor and share it. But many Christians have never had that experience of a real communal Eucharist, and it's eye-opening for them when they do. And I think for many young people who find going to church pretty uninteresting, and something of an ordeal they have to put up with until they're old enough to choose for themselves, for many young people to be able to celebrate the Eucharist in this more, let's say, communal but also contemplative way is an eye-opener. They begin to feel what the Eucharist really means. For many people today looking for deeper personal experience, this is one of the characteristics of modern identity. We want to know. We want to know for ourselves. We want to be able to feel the truth of what we're doing because we've discovered it, not because we've been told it. Truth is something we need to feel is revealed in us, something we can experiment with, experience, rather than just being told the answer. So for many, this is just part of what it means to be alive in this period of time. And so this has disengaged many people from a form of religion in which they feel very passive. And like children who refuse food, they don't like this particular kind of food, they don't like this vegetable, or they don't like what's good for them, they have left. I'm fast asleep here. It's very nice. I've never been happier to have people fall asleep during my talk. Anyway, so no, you can fall asleep. I've woken him up. Sorry. So this is where we can see Jesus as a teacher, and he empowers his disciples. Now he gives them, it's true, he gives them the bread and wine. That's his role in the ritual. And in theologically speaking, Jesus, in the Catholic tradition especially, Jesus is the celebrant of the Eucharist. The priest is there, obviously, but it's really symbolically to represent the fact that it is Christ who is celebrating this distribution of the food, of himself, the giving of himself, and the empowerment that follows from it. And this is why we have more recently refined our theology of the Church and of the Eucharist to emphasize the priesthood of all believers, that actually it's not just the priest who has this magical power, but the priest is fulfilling a role. That's a sacred role. It can be reverenced, it can be appreciated. But it's not that this magical power just resides in him or her, in other churches, but that the whole community gathered together around the table, or sitting in front of it usually, is filled with this activity of Christ. So Christ is celebrating the Eucharist in all of the people there. That's the theology. But the theology sometimes seems a little far removed from the feeling of the reality. So there is always this danger of passivity, of just being fed when we would like to actually share the food. Jesus is a teacher rare and unique, but rare in religious history, whose main purpose is not to hold power, not to be on a pedestal, but to empower his disciples. And this becomes very clear throughout the Gospel as he teaches them, not in order just to hold them to himself, but to send them out then. As he does on one occasion, he sends them out to see how you can do this, to teach, to preach, and to heal. And they come back amazed at what they can do. And then right at the end, of course, after his resurrection and his ascension, he again sends them out to the whole world to carry the message that he both gave and that he embodies. So he says also, I will be with you until the end of time. But this doesn't mean that he does all the work. He even, in one passage, goes so far as to say, you will do even greater things than me, because of how things have developed, because of the gift of the Spirit. So this is very important for understanding both the Eucharist and the Church itself and what Christian discipleship means. That we are not passive, we're not infantile, we're not kept in a subordinate relationship to the teacher, but the teacher is giving everything that he, in this case, can give us, so that we ourselves can pass it on, and in different cultures, in different generations, across time and space, we can renew and expand and develop the gift that he came to share. So he's a teacher who empowers us as his disciples. It's important to remember because teachers can be oppressive. It's a very delicate role, and even in the academic world or the medical world, your teacher can become a rather unhealthy influence, can exert oppressive authority over you, control their students, and develop a dependency among the students. In religious terms, there's the danger of guruism or guru worship, where the teacher becomes the substitute for the self, and the responsibility of each person to find and be themselves. And when that happens, it isn't long before something goes wrong, badly goes wrong. We've seen it in many examples of it over history in our own church, in churches. So the way in which the authority of the teacher can create unhealthy or dysfunctional or even abusive relationships. This is everything that Jesus does not embody and everything he does not teach. At the Last Supper, we begin with two important moments that illustrate what the Eucharist means and what he means as our teacher. The first is the washing of the feet. This is what we will do at Mass today. We try to get everybody in the church to do it, but that's a bit of an uphill struggle, so we may do it a little differently today. We can't force people to have their feet washed. And actually, this is exactly what happened at the Last Supper. So, Peter, of course, refused to have his feet washed. And I think a lot of people today in a more formal setting of a church would also refuse it. Jean Vanier, the founder of L'Arche, who is not a priest, sees this washing of the feet as the lost sacrament of Christianity. This is the ritual or the gesture that Jesus actually says explicitly, you must do this to each other as I have done it to you. So this is a definite, specific example. It doesn't even say that about the Eucharist. It's distribution of the bread and wine. He doesn't say you have to consecrate bread and wine on a regular basis. What he does say is you have to wash each other's feet physically. And our resistance to this is very revealing. It's embarrassing. It's making ourselves, it's exposing ourselves. Maybe we're not proud of our feet. It's humbling, because to take your shoes and socks off makes you vulnerable. So for all sorts of reasons, out of just shyness or other reasons, it's difficult to allow our feet to be washed by each other. In Peter's refusal, we see the slightly different reason, not perhaps that he was embarrassed to take his shoes and socks off, because he probably wasn't wearing the shoes and socks, but that this was a task that was performed by the waiter or the servant or the slave, not by the master. And in some monasteries, you will find that there's not many, but in some, they decide to keep this idea of the Eucharistic nature of community meals, because usually in a monastery you go straight from prayer to the dining room, to the refectory. So sometimes the abbot or the prior stands at the entrance to the refectory with a bowl and a jug of water and washes the hands of especially the guests probably who are arriving. A symbolic gesture that reminds us of Jesus at the beginning of the Last Supper. So Peter's resistance to this is our resistance to being put on an equal footing, literally, with the person we have put on a pedestal. So Jesus is coming off his pedestal big time in this symbolic gesture. And it is very disturbing. As it would be disturbing, should be disturbing sometimes, for the priest in the liturgy to step outside or off this pedestal of separation that he's sometimes forced to occupy. Even, coming down from the altar to share the sign of peace. I think that was once forbidden, not long ago, but sometimes these things get forbidden and then get forgotten as well, like not allowing altar servers. So, but the reason behind that is this embarrassment and, of course, this fear of losing the structure of relationship that is embedded in the power relationship. So Jesus turns this conventional power relationship of teacher and disciple on its head in a very disturbing way. And as Jean Vanier points out, we have tamed this radical gesture. So now it is the priest who chooses a few of the people, representative people from the congregation, and he washes their feet. But the empowerment that is happening in this gesture is that we, as he tells us, is that we should wash each other's feet. Not just that the priest or some minister washes our feet, but that we form a circle and perform this sacrament to each other. Anyway, that's the idea. And there's a lot of resistance to it. But the explanation for this comes in the second important element that prepares us for the Last Supper, when Jesus says, now you've seen what I've done for you, and this is the meaning of it, that you call me Lord and Master, and you put me on this pedestal. And, okay, he's more or less saying, I am your teacher. That is not untrue. However, I call you not servants, but friends. I call you servants no longer. So this is a definitive turning point in the relationship. And this turning point is the revelation that the deepest, truest aspect of our relationship with him is friendship, not subservience. And what does friendship mean? It's a very important question for philosophers. The nature of friendship and the meaning of friendship became one of the first philosophical topics. We're back for the ancient Greeks. Aristotle, I think it was Aristotle, said, the life without friendship is not worth living. The friend is another oneself. Another oneself. So this is not just casual friendship, playing golf with some friends or going to the movies. This is a deeper experience of our self in relationship to others or another. And friends of that kind we don't have often in our lives. So Jesus is explicitly calling us his friends, or telling us this is how he sees us, even if we can't see him in this way. But what is a friend? Well, the friend is another oneself. This comes out very clearly as we move into later, in a few days, into the meaning of the resurrection. Another oneself. And a friend must be an equal. There may be differences between you. They may have gifts that you don't have, and you may have interests that they don't have, so there may be a lot of differences between you. One may be successful, the other not successful in life. But if you see another person either as essentially superior to you or essentially inferior to you, friendship is impossible. Friendship has to grow in a equality of mutual respect and value. So, if this is the case, our relationship to Jesus is transfigured. We recognize his unique nature and position, and yet we are equal with him. And secondly, we are told that if this is real for us, if we can really see him like this, then this will transform our relationship with each other, and it will begin to form a new kind of community, which we call the church. Like any community, still imperfect. So in order for this to happen, as in all relationships, there has to be an optimum distance. That's what Jung said about all human relationships. Not too close, otherwise you get smothered. Not too distant, otherwise you can't enact the intimacy in various ways. And the real presence that the meal, the Last Supper, it embodies, exemplifies, needs solitude. It needs this space. It needs the otherness of the one who is another oneself. So, once again, we see how the whole story is built on paradox. Paradox is our way into the deeper levels of reality. And as we go into paradox, we awaken and need the contemplative consciousness. It's only with the contemplative mind that we can see paradox and not run away from it or not deny it. So the meaning of the Eucharist, which is very paradoxical, is revealed in contemplation. And a contemplative celebration of the Eucharist makes a big difference, rather than just, the 15-minute Mass, or the over-elaborate, the over-grand liturgy. There are many ways we can have a meal. And sometimes it's, 2 or 3 people being very informal. Sometimes it's a family affair, but it's still a special event. So we bring out the best stuff to put on the table. Sometimes it's a state banquet, or Mass at St. Peter's or in Canterbury Cathedral. So there are many different ways of having the meal. But to really understand the meaning of the Eucharist, we have to, I think, have at least some experience of celebrating it contemplatively, which means building into the form of the Mass times of silence and times of stillness. And this is what many celebrants cannot do. They're frightened to do it, partly because they fear that the congregation will rebel or walk out or won't come back, which is not the experience, actually, that happens. When a priest does take this risk and celebrate the Eucharist in a more contemplative way, maybe just putting 5 minutes of silence after communion, or taking a few moments at the beginning or of the celebration, or a few moments after the readings to allow them to sink in a little bit, so it's not all just, like an express train, stopping at different platforms for as short as possible. So, but when a priest does that, the people rarely complain. They might complain because they hadn't been told it was going to be 10 minutes longer than usual, and they couldn't get their cars out of the parking lot. But they don't actually complain about those few extra minutes. So, unless we have some experience of what a contemplative celebration of the Eucharist might feel like, we get stuck at the idea that the Eucharist is some kind of passive rather than empowering event. We get fed rather than sharing the food, and eventually we kind of feel we lose the optimum distance and we become separated from it. So we stop going to church, or we never even think about going to church. And so at the heart of this is this revelation of how Jesus sees us as friends rather than just worshippers. And this disempowers the power structure that we often cling to for the sake of security. So we like this distance between the priest up there and the people down here, because this is the way we've always done it. This gives us a little sense of security and stability in a changing world. and so on, for different reasons, different people. But what happens when we celebrate the Eucharist in a contemplative way is that the power structure is changed. There's still different roles, but the power structure between the participants and with the celebrant and the people on the altar, all of that is seen very differently. So that means also that the Eucharist is actually forming and nourishing a community. And when that happens, we begin to see that the Eucharist is not a privilege of club membership. And you have to have this card and pay your subscription in order to have the privileges of membership. Or, to be able to go into the lounge at an airport if you've got a gold card as a frequent traveler. But that's not really the nature of the gift, the self-giving aspect of the Eucharist. Quite the reverse. When we celebrate the Eucharist in a contemplative way, a community comes into being that exists not for itself, but for others. So it's not a community that simply reinforces its own identity by excluding others, which is one way you can reinforce your identity, is by saying to others you're not a member or you've broken some of the rules. Well, I think Judas broke a couple of rules too, but he was not excluded. So should you be excluded because you divorced and remarried, for example, in the Catholic rule system at the moment, which is under review, but causing a lot of conflict. So I think what allows us to see this is the experience, not just the theology, but the experience of celebrating the Mass in this way. And the first step, let's just say, have 5 minutes or so of silence after communion. Just the first step. Real presence radicalizes all the power-based relationships in our lives. When we are really present, as Jesus, we say, has a real presence to us, then, and we become really present to that presence, and that means attention, it means the ability to be still, it means the ability to keep our mind in one place for 5 minutes or 5 seconds. So when we become really present to that real presence extended towards us, then the forms of relationship that we have in daily life, the power structures or the social structures that we have are all affected and undergo a change. And 2 things that would really change if we rediscovered the Eucharist in this sense would be patriarchy, a male-dominated power structure just doesn't fit into this experience. It would begin to change, not without a few explosions, but it would be undermined. And secondly, clericalism, which is in many cases related to this patriarchy, but where the priest is put, often to their own discomfort, on this pedestal where there is no optimum distance, but there's a separation. So I think these are two things that would begin to change within the Christian community as soon as we begin to celebrate the Eucharist in this more contemplative way. So let's leave it there. We'll pick it up this afternoon a little more as we prepare for the Mass of the Lord's Supper, and we can share a little more about it if you like after meditation. Okay. So here's we'll prepare for the meditation now with a piece of self-generated scripture, a haiku, and another passage from the Upanishads. Sudden waking, dark sky, stairs, moonlight. Through windows, sharp outline. Horizontal, vertical bars crossing, cross of love. Okay. So as the Last Supper, the meaning of the Eucharist tells us a lot about the body. This passage from the Chandogya Upanishad is quite relevant. In the center of the castle of Brahman, our own body, there is a small shrine in the form of a lotus flower, and within can be found a small space. We should find who dwells there, and we should want to know him. And if anyone asks, who is he who dwells in a small shrine in the form of a lotus flower in the center of the castle of Brahman? Whom should we want to find and to know? We can answer, the little space within the heart is as great as this vast universe. The heavens and the earth are there, and the sun and the moon and the stars. Fire and lightning and winds are there, and all that now is and all that is not. For the whole universe is in him, and he dwells within our heart. And if they should say, if all things are in the castle of Brahman, all beings and all desires, what remains when old age overcomes the castle, or when the life of the body is gone? We can answer, the spirit who is in the body does not grow old and does not die. And no one can ever kill the spirit who is everlasting. This is the real castle of Brahman, wherein dwells all the love of the universe. It is Atman, pure spirit, beyond sorrow, old age, and death, beyond evil and hunger and thirst. It is Atman, whose love is truth, whose thoughts are truth. I am the vine, this is from the Gospel of John. I am the vine, and you the branches. Whoever dwells in me, as I dwell in him, bears much fruit. For apart from me, you can do nothing. Whoever does not dwell in me is thrown away like a withered branch. If you dwell in me, and my words dwell in you, ask what you will, and you shall have it. This is my Father's glory, that you may bear fruit in plenty, and so be my disciples. As the Father has loved me, so I have loved you. Dwell in my love.